This is the August 2nd meeting of the Board of Directors of Marin Municipal Water, and we need a roll call.
Director Gibson,
Here.
Vice President Schmidt,
Here.
and President Russell.
Here. Okay. We needed a motion to adopt the agenda.
Move approval of the agenda.
Second.
Roll call, please.
Director Gibson,
Aye.
Vice President Schmidt,
Aye.
and President Russell.
Aye. Public comment on items not on the agenda.
Yes, there are a couple. The first two, Ed Jamison, then James Krajewski. Go ahead, Mr. Jamison.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Loud and clear.
Well, here we are again. Tonight, we'll once again consider conservation, an already disproved solution to our drought terror. On April 19th, district staff presented an elegant analysis showing truly minimal so-called conservation opportunities going forward. Then again, on May 10th, we had a truly exhaustive review of such opportunities featuring expert conservation consultant Peter Mayer, who so memorably concluded that the conservation sponge has already been wrung dry in Marin. Tonight's presentation looks like an unnecessary rehash of the May 10th meeting, consuming staff time that could be better spent elsewhere. The nonsense of aspirational conservation goals must not obstruct the Jacobs process of figuring out how to rescue Marin from its obvious drought extreme risk. To his credit, President Russell put a stop to this nonsense in a meeting in February or March. We continue to live with a sword of Damocles hanging over us. Our recent 20% or so reductions from 2020 levels are the result of our continuing fear that by next April, we may well return to the terror we experienced last year. The board needs to focus on that and disregard demands for still more presentations and calls for aspirational conservation goals, rather than focusing on the actual enhancement of our supply. Marin's silent majority is terrified of revisiting last year's possibility of inadequate water even for indoor use, let alone for firefighting. An East Bay mud pipeline would require killing most of Marin's landscaping, damaging the values of our homes. The Marin IJ's Dick Spotswood and Richard Rubin represent the silent majority when they speak of the need for drought-proof supply. Unlike out-of-date conservation acolytes who say deprivation is the answer, in the face of a 13% mandated increase in our population, whether we like it or not. The board has become an Orwellian big brother, leaving us not flushing toilets, not taking showers, and killing landscape, all burnishing the so-called conservation credentials of part of this board, but putting 191,000 people at risk. The board needs to reject discredited deprivation strategies in favor of the rational solutions being determined by the Jacobs plan process. Thank you.
Thank
For the
you.
future, Ed, that probably, I let it go, but that comment should have been with the item on the agenda. That really wasn't a comment on items not on the agenda, just for future reference.
Mr. James Krajewski, then Phil Sauter. Go ahead, Mr.
Hi.
Krajewski.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Once again, I'm speaking to the same old issue. Way back in April, Director Kohler vigorously declared that the water district had never rationed water during her term on the board. I was a bit astounded by this claim and subsequently asked Director Kohler via email for her definition of rationing and the source of the definition. I have never received a reply despite several emails over the past months and despite speaking up at multiple board meetings. I still have no idea why a board member would refuse to answer a simple question such as this after having made such a declaration. Had Director Kohler responded weeks ago to my email request, none of this ongoing saga would be necessary. If there's some legitimate reason for not answering the question, then why not say so? Director Kohler's words on the recording of the board meeting led me to think that her definition had something to do with whether the district has placed physical device restrictions on customers' water use. If that's the case, and I don't know if that's what she meant, the argument is a bit like saying that California doesn't have speed limits because authorities don't put throttles on our cars. Indeed, the district has placed numerous restrictions on water use that limit the water coming out of customers' faucets. those restrictions fit traditional and current uses of the term rationing. I am at a loss to understand what the district gains by the director's silence and my persistent request at the beginning of each recorded board meeting. At this point, all of the directors have heard my question and they are aware of the situation. Just to be clear, the question is a simple two-part one. What is your definition of rationing and what is the source of the definition? For those running for elected offices this year, I ask, do you believe it's acceptable for directors to ignore constituents' questions in this manner? Do all the directors agree that silence in response to my question is an appropriate response? From my perspective, silence is not always golden. Sometimes it's evidence of tarnish on the image of an organization. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Krajewski. Mr. Phil Sauter, please.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to share a short story that a neighbor told me when we were taking a walk a couple weeks ago. He's a beekeeper and he went over to a fellow that lives near Dominican in San Rafael who had a beehive he wanted to get rid of. And as the gates opened, my neighbor drove up the driveway and he saw the overhead sprinklers chugging away and a vast green lawn that he said looked like the old San Geronimo golf course. Going to the house, my neighbor stepped on the lawn and he said his foot sunk right in. Now, my neighbor is one of those folks who puts a bucket in the shower to water his outside plants. But it occurred to me that both my neighbor and the guy with the lawn sprinklers are following district water use guidance during drought conditions. Both messages have, as long as the guy wasn't drenching his lawn more than twice a week. It also occurred to me that if the district had a flume device everywhere, or at least with a couple thousand tier 4 customers, it would know who to reach out to in times of drought or when drought is becoming likelier so that customers have the time to adjust. And then it occurred to me that the district might already have some of these flume stories that it could use and submit to sort of bolster its request and increase its odds of getting that AMI grant. I'm going to take another 30 seconds and share a news story I saw a few weeks ago about a Southern California water district that had a bunch of heavy water users that, and in fact, these were some film stars. I think they mentioned Sylvester Stallone and a few other people, one of whom was out, with a wheelbarrow taking sod out of her lawn. They'd gone after these people by huge rates and huge fines, and it wasn't getting any results. So one guy, they put in a little water flow restrictor that looked about the size of a quarter with a 1/4-inch hole in the middle. And that customer, I think, got 50 gallons a day, and they left that in there for about 3 months. And I said, now that's my definition of rationing. They tried conservation and then they tried rationing. And once the guy lived with that for 3 months, he did change his behavior. So just a couple of quick stories. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speakers, we have Clayton Smith and Mimi Willard. Go ahead, Mr. Smith.
Oh, hi. First, I'm really wondering when you're going to have in-person meetings at your facility on the freeway. We're long past the COVID. We've got this bogus monkeypox. I don't think anyone's really at great risk of it. And it would be nice to be able to actually be able to engage with you in the old manner, which is in person, so we could actually see you in the flesh. I think that would be helpful in dialogue. And the other question I have is, I'm looking here, I don't see any available information. How many people are now online? Can you actually tell me, whoever is in charge of your technology, how many people are actually logged into this? I think I'm almost always hearing the same people online here. And I'm wondering if there's actually a few more people that are just watching and not making comments. But if it's only the people making comments, then I guess there's only a half a dozen people attending your meetings, which is given the seriousness of the situation. Pretty much a public outreach deficit. Questions that have come up in discussing this idea of smart meters on our water intake. Question that has come up often is the shutoff capacity. Are they going to be things that you will have the ability from your central facility to actually terminate people's access to water remotely? And will that make it so that the customers will lose their control over their valves? And finally, last night I was at the Mill Valley City Council meeting, and I brought up the ongoing traffic backup problem on Miller Avenue that I suggested could be addressed by having some proper traffic management provided during your work. They said that they had talked about this months ago, but I was shocked at the fact that they hadn't been able to come to the simple solution of having somebody go down to the 2 a.m. club and deal with this during those peak moments of traffic flow on Miller, which created a backup. Today, I must have spent 15 minutes getting from downtown Mill Valley to the 2 a.m. club, which I think is a pretty inexcusable way of managing that project. Thank you.
Thank you. There are 33 people on this Zoom right now.
Good. That's
Oh, I apologize on that, Mr. Smith.
Smith.
Thanks, sorry. The next three, Miss Mimi Willard, then Chris Wright, then Marin Conservation League. Go ahead, Miss Willard.
Yes, good evening. I want to talk with you this evening about the coming rate cycle that will be entered into in earnest immediately after the election, with consultant studies and ultimately discussion of the rate structure by the board pretty quickly leading up to rate increases to be executed via hearing probably in May of next year. The coming rate hikes could be very big, owing to last year's falling revenues and unusually high spending on things like the pipeline. It didn't happen. And then looking forward, there is going to definitely be a need to spend on various ways to increase the water supply, be it desal, recycling, etc., as well as a need to do more on the way of vegetation management for fire prevention to protect the security of our water. So the Coalition of Sensible Taxpayers and many ratepayers do understand these factors, and while they won't necessarily be happy about it, they understand the need to increase rates. The issue here is fairness, though. The current rates are unfair in the rate structure that was put in place in 2019. This is the opportunity as we come into the new 4-year cycle that will be contemplated in, right after the first of the year. It's the time to make some changes. Currently, many people get really big water bills and use very little water. That's because of the very big fixed fees, which are unusually high percentage-wise relative to your peers in the rest of California. I have a friend who's a low water user. He uses about 2 units per bi-monthly cycle. His bi-monthly bill is $180, of which $18 is for water. So this charge structure, besides being unfair, is, as I keep saying over and over again, anti-conservation. We go on and on talking about conservation, and yet we have a rate structure that violates the basic principles of how to use rates to incentivize conservation. So in advance of the election and rate cycle, directors should clearly state whether they will commit to redressing the wrongs of the current rate structure with a more fair rate structure in the coming year. I'm out of time here, but I want to point out that COST did send to MMWD, I believe, and other similar agencies a memo indicating the necessity to continue to at least have a hybrid structure of your board meetings in order to ensure disability access on a going forward basis, with probably 3 to 5% of Marin's population qualifying as immunocompromised. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Wright, please. Mr. Chris Wright. Okay, oh, there you are. Go ahead. Mr.
I wanted to speak on safety at the lake. I walk at the lake every day. I walk around Bontempe twice every day. And in the year that, or over a year that I've been walking out there on the trails, I have only seen a ranger twice in over a year. And when I say the trails, I'm not talking about the dam or the parking lot or the road. I'm talking about the trails. Now, when we're talking about fire safety, nobody does anything about people smoking out there. And a few days after the fire, I walked across the dam at 6:30 at night on Saturday night, and I saw a couple. He was fishing, and she was cooking a fish in a frying pan right after the fire. And I said, you know, there's no open flame out here. And she said, we'll be real careful. And I just find a lot of things on the fire. I was there the day of the fire. I called the ranger station at 9:31 a.m. And then when I got off the phone, a minute or two later, I flagged down a ranger and informed him of the fire, which he was unaware of. I don't understand why there wouldn't be an emergency response system in place that as soon as they get the call, that every person that is fire trained out there knows right at that moment. I heard about on Nextdoor about how they're selling all the fire prevention for after a fire starts. But from what I see out at the lakes, there's nothing that's done for fire prevention before the fire starts. And as far as the fire goes that day, that fire it was like perfect condition. I was across the lake. I heard the screaming. I looked over and the hillside was on fire. And the wind was blowing slightly towards me, which is towards the lake. So that was perfect. There was a gentleman there for the victim. You know, these are things, if it was out of control fire and phone service out there, I have Xfinity. We were fortunate my phone worked. So there's a lot of things there. When we're talking about prevention, we're talking about it after the fact when we should be talking about it before to stop the fire before it ever gets going. Because the cost to stop it before it gets going is a lot cheaper than stopping it after it starts.
Thanks, Mr. Wright.
Yep.
And Marin Conservation League, please.
Good evening. It's Larry Menikis. I'm logged into the other, log out of that one. I'm going to be brief. I just would like to address the sometimes exasperation of people who speak here, and to understand that the Brown Act restricts what the board can respond to for the benefit of the public, so that items that are not on the agenda do not start becoming part of a discussion here. So that if there's a specific question or concern a member of the public has, it's always best to either send it generally to staff or address it to your specific director for your region if you're really looking for a response. And written correspondence is always good. It's always good to speak in public, but understand that really none of us should be asking questions or expect the questions that we're going to be asking to be answered at this time. And I would just like to remind people of that. Thank you, and looking forward to tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Menikis. There are no further public comments.
Okay, thank you all. Directors and general managers announcements. Ben, you have anything?
None tonight, President Russell.
Okay, Jack? Jack? I guess that's a no.
That's a no.
Okay, Monty?
Nothing from me tonight.
Okay, nothing from me. Okay, with that, I need a motion to approve the consent calendar.
Move approval of the consent calendar. Second.
Roll call.
Director Gibson,
Aye.
Vice President Schmidt.
Aye.
And President Russell.
Aye. Okay, the next item is item 3, license agreement for the Mount Tam communication site.
And Jared, did you want me to put up the,
The what?
I'm attempting to share my screen. Is it
Do
coming
you
up?
need help with the PowerPoint, Jared?
there you
Let's
go.
see if it
There you
works.
There it goes.
Is
You
it
got
up?
it. You got it. You got it.
Mr. Mills will be presenting tonight on this site.
Hello, my name is Jared Mills. I'm the staff attorney at Marin Water, and I'll be presenting item 3 tonight, which is a license agreement for the Mount Tamalpais communications sites with EIP Holdings 2 LLC. To guide tonight's discussion, we prepared just a brief PowerPoint to kind of run us through this item. After the presentation, if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer those. So let's see if this will share. Hold on, let me reopen it. You would think after 2 years, I would have this down.
We do think that, yes.
I can pull it up quickly if you like, Jared.
The magic of technology.
There we go.
I'm with you all the way, Jared.
That's
It's-
because you're still looking at it sideways, Jack.
Yeah, all right.
There we go. Okay. All right,
There
so
you go.
tonight we're
That's
talking
working.
about the, sorry about that. Tonight we're talking about the Mount Tam communication site. So the site's actually composed of 2 separate facilities. There's a primary location or communications facility that's on the middle peak of the mountain. And then on the west peak, there's a building 402 location. Both of these facilities, they host an array of different communication sites from TV, cellular, and radio communications. If we look, this is the Middle Peak site. So this is the primary site. You'll see the telephone arrays around it. And then to the right side of the image there, you can't see it, but that's most of the telecommunications facilities that are facing towards San Francisco. The building 402 site is primarily just a radio communications facility. You can see the small building there with the radio antennas around it. So back in 1979, the district first entered into a lease agreement for this site and the development of this site with Watson Communications. Subsequently, that was signed to American Tower LP or ATC. And since 1979, this lease has been extended twice and it expires on August 30th, 2022. Under the current lease terms, we have 2 different kind of gross revenue shares from the facilities. At the main or primary communications site, we get the greater of 35% of the gross revenues received from the subtenants there, or $35,000 a month. In the building 402 site, we get 75% of the gross revenues. And the total revenues for those sites together, you can see there, we have it for fiscal year 2021. It's approximately $630,000, and that's just the district share. That's not the total revenue that's brought in. The district engulfed kind of on a request for proposals for this site back in March of 2022. You can see a lot of the deadlines there that led up to tonight. I would say kind of most importantly, the final proposals were received on April 20th. After meeting with the board in closed session, we requested last, best, and final offers on June 24th. We received those in the middle of July, reviewed them, and tonight we're making a final recommendation for the award of the license agreement. The selected proposal here with Everest Infrastructure Partners through their holding company EIP Holdings 2 LLC. The terms of that agreement will include a few things. The first thing is the one-time upfront payment of $1.5 million. And under this agreement, we'll also continue to receive a profit share of the gross revenues, which will be 70%. There is a floor on this, or a minimum, which is $40,000 monthly. The cap on that's not to exceed 85% of the total gross revenues. And this is subject to an annual escalation of either 4% or the Bay Area CPI, whichever is greater. The lease term initially will be 10 years, and then Everest would have 4 5-year options to extend for a total of up to 30 years. Under the agreement, they will be required to maintain the road to both sites, and then also they'll pay to the district an annual $25,000 vegetation management fee. This fee will cover vegetation management that's further out from the facilities, just to ensure a larger buffer of defensible space. And that's also subject to an annual escalator of 5% or the Bay Area CPI, whichever is greater. Tonight, our recommendation is that the board approve the proposed license agreement with EIP Holdings 2 LLC on the price and terms that's substantially set forth in the draft license agreement, which is included in the board packet, and authorize the general manager to finalize and execute the license agreement. And just so the board and the public are aware, these are non-rate revenues, which means that they fund things like the district's low income discount program and medical waiver program for customers. And another thing to note is this is a substantial, I would say, win for the district in the fact that we will receive, if approved tonight, the $1.5 million upfront payment and an additional approximately $400,000 annually. So with that, if there are any questions, I will stop sharing my screen and I will be happy to answer those.
I have a couple of questions for you, Jared. My biggest concern with this is, as I read the lease or the license, they have responsibility for the vegetation management and so forth. Obviously, that's something we want to have a level of control on. So the fact that they're responsible for it, what kind of control do we have? How can we make sure that what they're doing on the subject site is consistent with our overall plan for the watershed in general for wildfire protection?
Yeah, so Director Gibson, to that point, historically what's happened at this site is the licensee will actually submit their proposal or plan for the vegetation management for staff's review. We'll review that and make sure it's consistent with the local fire department's recommendations for defensible space. And then what's actually new under this license agreement is the additional vegetation management fee, which will actually be conducted by our staff. That work would be to allow us to go into the site using those additional funds to clear even more defensible space.
Okay. All right, and you indicated that it's a 10-year with 4 5 years. I think we have the right at the same time to terminate it at that point. It's either party. Am I right about that?
Yes, I believe that's correct. Molly, correct me if I'm wrong on that.
I think that's right. We do. It's both parties.
Yeah, and just as a curiosity, why are we doing a license agreement as opposed to the traditional lease agreement?
I can take that one if you want, Jared.
Okay.
You know, it's really just a decision about you know, the type of interest that we're granting up on the watershed. Both are used for communications facilities. A license agreement is really more about the terms of the written agreement than a lease would be, because of some of the legal issues surrounding a leasehold interest, because it's considered a real property interest, where a license agreement really does come down to the terms of the document. So it's sort of a legal judgment call.
Yeah, no, which, by the way, I agreed with. I thought it was clever.
Thank you.
I have one comment, Jared. In the future, please make the presentations parallel. So you gave it the page that showed what the current income was. I would have preferred you had exactly the same page with the new income. So just to summarize for folks, it was about 650,000 currently. It'll be over $1 million for the same property. So please try to do that in parallel, so it's very easy for people to see. This is the old one, this is the new one. The next question I have is, who owns all the equipment? The antennas and...
Yeah, so most of the antennas and equipment, my understanding, is owned by the sub-licensees. And there's a various number of operators, from government radio equipment to private entities.
And what do we gain by having this third party in the middle, as opposed to just dealing with the guys that own the equipment?
Do you want me to answer that, Jared?
Yeah, go ahead, and I may have things to add as well.
Yes, of course. Okay. I think primarily, President Russell, there's a lot involved with just the real estate work of getting folks on board, signed up, managing the agreements, managing the payment of the monthly revenue stream. All of that then is handled by the intermediary, and it frees the district staff up to do what we're supposed to be doing, which is delivering water. This is a great opportunity for us to maximize the revenue stream there, but not get bogged down in all of the minutia details that are involved in administering a complex facility like this. And we also appreciate that the proposers have a lot more expertise and knowledge and understanding about what the market will bear and what it requires. Jared, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would say that is all accurate. The other thing is, obviously, each of these facilities has to have a current license with the FCC and that type of compliance stuff, which, this entity is an expert in, and at the district, we don't have that knowledge base.
It must be kind of interesting, though, to own the equipment and then have to pay. I guess it's like renting the land, huh? Is what they're basically doing. The location. They're putting their, and the what?
And the airspace.
Sure.
The fact that it's so high up and
sure.
Yeah.
But it's still just renting the land. The topography is the topography, but what they're actually doing is renting so many square feet of land through this third party to get their space. And I'd like to thank both of you for your hard work on this, and with the success of substantially increasing the income to the district for basically the same thing. So that's very well done.
Do you have a nutshell description of the benefit to the community with this equipment in place? I mean, there is obviously a benefit to the community. I don't mean to put you on the spot, because I know I couldn't do that, but how would you describe a benefit that the community in general gets from this?
Well, I would say initially, just on the district level, right, this funds, like I said, the non-rate revenue programs. So our low income customers that we can't fund a subsidy through water rates, this actual revenue would fund to help support or subsidize their water bill. Same with the medical waiver program that the district offers customers who need additional water for a medical condition. So those are kind of the benefits on the water side. More directly with the actual equipment, as I was saying earlier, it's a lot of various users up there. So radio, television, cell service. I know a gentleman said earlier, cell service in the watershed can be poor. As you saw, there were multiple cell antennas there. In addition to that, there is some, radio equipment for like MIRA, for example. So in the event of an emergency in Marin County, this is a site that hosts some of their equipment. So it would be important for emergency response.
Yeah, good. Okay. Thank you. I think, Monty, any comments?
Nope, nothing for me.
Okay, thank you. Public comment?
Yeah, we have 4 speakers. The first 2, Roger Roberts, then Chris Wright. Go ahead, Mr. Roberts.
I'd like to follow up on Jack's comments about vegetation management. I noticed in one of the photos, there's some sizable fir trees in the background. And in a wildfire, if they catch, they're going to throw embers onto the site. So I'm asking, have we actually gone up there and done a careful analysis of the total vegetation management required in the event of wildfire reaching this site? If not, then maybe we should do that and make sure the vegetation management program will actually cover those risks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Wright.
Yeah, my question would be on the cell towers. My understanding is they face towards San Francisco. And if we don't have cell service in the watershed, why aren't we asking them during these negotiations to cover that area with the negotiations?
President Russell, if you want me to respond to any of these questions now or at
Sure,
the end of
go
public
ahead. Yeah,
comment.
sure, go ahead. Sure.
Sure. With respect to the first question from Mr. Rogers, my understanding is there is an evaluation of that area by our watershed management team, including the vegetation management. And one of the reasons why we made the modification from having the operator carry out all of the vegetation management in the surrounding area, transitioning that to a payment for our staff and contractors to actually take that on, is so that we would have greater control over just how quickly, when, and how it was completed. So that is something we do consider carefully. Sorry, I'm trying to remember the next question, the cell tower coverage.
Yeah.
The cell tower coverage question, it's really not as simple as pointing, I think, and I'm not an expert on this by any means, but it's really not as simple as pointing the towers up there on the mountain top or middle peak down at the watershed. There's lots of nooks and crannies down at the watershed, and we are looking at, and I believe the watershed team again is doing an evaluation of how we might install some repeaters to improve cell coverage, but it's a bit more complex than just having the right tower in the right.
Yeah, I would, Molly, if I could add, this very question was brought up during closed session as to the coverage in our watershed. And because of that, we have been meeting with companies, to cellular companies and microwave relay companies to get a grasp on where our dead zones are. And we are looking at installing some repeaters, especially around the Cataract Trail area where we often have search and rescue exercises throughout the year. So we are working on that at board request, and it's really a matter of local towers within the watershed. So we are hoping to improve coverage within the watershed in the future.
I think a better term than nooks and crannies is that it's the topography that drives the alignment of the cell towers.
That is a much better statement, President.
And basically, they put them where they get the maximum bang for the buck. That's what they're pointed at. And when you turn, it's all line of sight. So when you turn a corner, you no longer are in line of sight to the tower. Basically, if your phone can't see the tower, it can't talk to the tower.
Okay, thank you. Next speaker is Clayton Smith. Go ahead, Mr. Smith.
Yeah, a couple of questions. One thing is, since you're taking over control of the vegetation management that's proximate to this facility, are you also assuming the liability for fire damage should it occur to the facility? You're not.
No,
You've checked that out.
we're
Okay,
not.
that's.
We require,
Well, hold on, let me
coverage.
finish as your clock is running. The other, what competitive bidding effort was made? And was there anyone who stepped up to bid on this facility? And the third thing is it's widely believed and probably very true that cell radiation creates a desiccating effect on plants. And so my concern, I was unaware there even was such a facility up there, and also on wildlife. So adding a lot of repeaters into the watershed, is this going to increase the fire danger that will happen as a consequence of the desiccation effect on the plant life that is proximate to those repeaters? And also, given these, is there any sort of regulation over the actual amount of electromagnetic intensity of activity occurring from this facility? And is there some limitations put on it so as to avoid having the facility itself become a cause of a future emergency event up there on the mountain? Thanks.
Thank you.
Molly,
Are you
going to address those issues?
I can do that. Mr. Smith, will
Sure.
you finish with your comments?
I'm done.
So the competitive process we undertook was a request for proposals, and we tried to communicate that out as broadly as we could within the industry. And we did receive 3 competitive proposals for the license agreement. We reviewed those. We went through a initial review process, and then we requested last, best, and final responses from 2 of the proposers, and then selected a finalist. So yes, it was competitive. I really can't speak to the plant impacts. I can defer to someone else if they know about that. And certainly if there's activity that we're going to be undertaking, we would look at that issue. As far as regulating the site itself, the FCC has purview over the telecommunications facilities, and those are permitted sites. They have been there a very long time, and all of the different communications facilities, again, as I think we said earlier, need to have the correct permits and be in compliance with all the regulatory requirements. And that's one of the reasons why we have an operator who's familiar with those requirements.
And don't forget, there's a third party here, which is not part of this lease, which is the federal government. The FAA has the radome up there that covers everything from the Canadian border to the Mexican border, one shot off of Mount Tam. So that's that advantage of height that Molly was talking about previously. Okay, Terry.
There are no further comments or raised hands.
Okay.
Oh,
So
yeah, there are none. I apologize. Go ahead.
no, okay. So we need a motion to approve.
I'll move approval.
Hello, guys.
Second.
Jack,
Yeah, I'll second.
okay. Roll call.
Director Gibson,
Aye.
Vice President Schmidt,
Aye.
and President Russell.
Aye. Okay. Is that what you need, Molly, or need something else from us? I don't see an actual.
We're all set. Thank you. We'll
Okay.
assume that that was the recommendation we made. That was approved. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, strategic water supply assessment.
Good evening, members of the board, members of the public. Paul Sellier, Water Resources Director. We have a presentation this evening, and we're going to pull that up here. So this evening, our goal is really to help us understand what level and how conservation is included in the strategic water supply assessment, and to provide information on the cost of the conservation program in a similar fashion to what we've done with all of the water management alternatives. And so we'll begin tonight with a sort of a conservation review, where we'll take a look at our current program and how that program relates to things like drought response actions and, of course, conservation as it is part of the strategic water supply assessment. And tonight we have Carrie Pollard, our water use efficiency manager, who will walk us through and get into some of the details of the conservation that we're including as part of the strategic water supply assessment. And then we have Peter Mayer joining us. And Peter, you may recall, is a professional engineer and one of the nation's foremost leading experts on urban water use. And Peter will provide his perspective, a review of what we've included as part of the strategic water supply assessment in terms of conservation, and let us know if there's opportunities for us to perhaps even go further than that. And then we'll close with sort of a quick summary of what we've talked about tonight. So all conservation programs have these foundational elements, ingredients, if you like, of a conservation program. And it's the outreach and community engagement, incentive programs and initiatives, and of course, regulations in the form of policy and ordinances. And all of these contribute to what is essentially long-term savings, which is the goal of any conservation program itself. The district's program specifically, in terms of incentives, has it's really an industry leading. It has a broad array of incentives that is somewhat unusual to find all of these different types of incentives that would be covered in a single program. And many of these incentives target both traditional water savings areas and leading edge areas, such as gray water. And as I said, it is unusual to have this kind of wide array of incentives. When we look at the district's conservation program in terms of its policy and regulations, it's quite comprehensive. In fact, among the most comprehensive. And you find again in here elements that you don't find in other program policies, such as gray water, such as limiting overhead spray irrigation to 2 days a week. And these are all part of our sort of normal year, non-drought year program at this point. As we move along to take a look at the sort of third leg, which is our conservation and outreach programs, outreach and education, excuse me, these are among the most popular aspects of our conservation program. And you'll note that for all of these, the workshops, the eco-friendly garden tours, while these contribute to the conservation program and are an essential component of our conservation program, it's really impossible for us to quantify how much water each one of these would save for us. Yet they're an indispensable component of the program itself. So when you put these three things together, we have our industry-leading program in terms of the incentives, the policies, and indeed the outreach and education components. And so you might ask, well, is it well-funded? And what this slide shows is the dollars per capita invested in the conservation program, and showing just financial year 2021, but this trend holds for the past decade or more. And we're among the leaders in per capita investment in conservation. And I would add, while this slide again focuses on our region specifically, as we look into the broader area of the Bay Area and indeed the rest of California and the West, this continues to hold true. So we'll just pause for a minute for some sort of a quick definition break, because definitions are important. And in particular, when we talk about conservation, we need to know how we might think about what measuring or indicators of whether water is being used efficiently. And to do that, we use some jargon, of course. So GPCD being the first one, and it's gallons per capita per day. And it's the average total water produced by the district in a day divided by the total population. So total water produced and sent out to all sectors, residential, industrial, commercial, landscape, customers, all that water, and then divided by the population. The RGPCD is the residential gallons per capita per day. And it's the sort of daily average water that's delivered to our residential customers divided by the total population. So the difference between the two is the first one is sort of total water by the district divided by the population. And the second one is just the water provided to our residential customers divided by the total population, who of course are our residential customers. Both GPCD and RGPCD are useful indicators of water use efficiency. And they allow us to look at water use efficiency in the face of either increasing or decreasing population. So they're quite useful in that respect. And since in our case in the district, most of the water used in the district is used by residential customers, we're particularly interested in the RGPCD number as an indicator of water use efficiency. Okay, so back to our regularly scheduled programming. So as we look at conservation in general, this sort of crude schematic on the left shows that both drought response actions and conservation as a water supply are part or a subset, if you like, of an overall conservation program. And when we look at the bullets to the right, which characterize the sort of main aspects of each of these three types of conservation. In the conservation program itself that we just talked about and reviewed for the district, it's classically an ongoing long-term demand reduction. That's the goal of the program. It's incentivized and totally voluntary for the most part. And it includes both quantifiable, but also leading edge initiatives that have aspirational water savings goals. And as I mentioned, in terms of the outreach and education programs that are part of it, these are non-quantifiable programs that we wouldn't be able to put a total number to in terms of acre feet per year that we might be saving. Yet they're still an essential component of the program. Drought response actions, in much the same way that we all went through last year during the emergency, these are typically, sort of short-term goals that have very defined objectives. We would be asking customers for a particular percentage of savings, and ultimately, were we to need to, we would be moving to some form of mandatory conservation measures, up to and including penalties for overuse of water. Acknowledging that drought response actions do drive in some, small measure, some long-term benefit. In other words, we don't see a total rebound from the sort of bottom water usage of the drought, the smallest water usage we might get in the drought, to it doesn't bounce back to where all the way back to where it was pre-drought. So there may be some long-term benefit here. And then as we look at conservation as a water supply, to distinguish that from the conservation program itself, it's quite similar, right? It has the same long-term demand reduction goal. It's incentivized and voluntary, but it includes quantifiable programs only that we can calculate the water savings for. So those are the characteristics and the primary differences between the conservation program itself and conservation as a water supply, is this notion of quantifiable and calculated water savings.
So Paul, if I could,
Yeah.
to be clear, if you go back, these aren't mutually exclusive, and maybe that's self-evident for the public, but I just wanted to just reinforce that what we're saying is the conservation as a water supply is essentially a slice of the pie or an element of the broader conservation program. So staff fully expects both of these programs are going to continue to be developed. It's just recognition that there's a broader program that we can be and are and will continue to be aspirational and innovative. Yet when we calculate for the strategic water supply assessment, where we're actually identifying how much less water do we need in a more traditional water supply effort, we're subtracting how much we can get from conservation. So we can't be aspirational, we don't believe. We need to be able to have a higher level of confidence in how much water savings will be achieved through, say, turf replacement, compared and distinguished from education, that it's the right thing, it's a good thing, we're educating the next generation with our school programs, but we wouldn't necessarily project how much savings we're going to get from that program. So I just wanted to kind of reinforce that key message, even though you did a great job.
Yeah, and you're ahead of me by one slide. So
wait, if you go back 1 second, Paul.
Yep,
sure. I think that the term aspirational is potentially colored or misleading in a way that, because in some ways it's not aspirational. Sort of almost says that there's no bounded or range of what's within reason, and I think that in many ways, but correct me if you think I'm wrong, that the water savings they're not aspirational so much as they are difficult to quantify, but there is a range of response that we have seen as a result. And so it's not, I don't know if it really actually is truly aspirational. It's just that it has a broader bounded range.
Yeah, Director Schmidt, I think that's a good point. I'd say what I think in terms of aspirational, for example, is to set, let's just say turf replacement, an aspirational goal that we would hope to get, compared to perhaps a lower level that we have the confidence in to put that into the water supply assessment and subtract that amount of water from our target additional supplemental supply we may need.
Yeah, so I think, again, aspirational says to me, it says or implies that it's wishful, but it's really you can't count on it. And I don't think that's I don't think that's what you're actually saying, is that we can't count on it. It's just that it is the next bullet says. I don't think it's non-quantifiable. I think that I think it's that there's a range there that is just difficult to quantify, and therefore it's not as easy to rely upon given its broad range.
Yeah.
Well,
go ahead, Paul.
I was just going to add, so as perhaps an example of a leading edge initiative, if we looked at gray water, and distinct from turf, right, where we have some direct experience of how much turf we can replace, given pretty unlimited resources during the drought emergency, that gives us this sort of empirical data point that we can use to then establish what sort of square footage we think would be reasonable for us to think about achieving in a normal year.
Mm-hmm.
And so, because we know the number of turf replacements that need to occur, and we can kind of, adjust from the drought emergency that we're in, and in some cases, right, we have experience in pre-drought of what those numbers were. So we're using all of that data that's available to us to try to come up with a quantifiable number, for example, for turf replacement, that we would have high levels of confidence in achieving based on the funding and the staffing and so on that we know we would need. And then compare that to gray water programs, where it does look like gray water programs should have the potential for significant water savings. Yet our experience with them has been that we don't have a lot of industry, take up of gray water programs. And so
yeah, as one of the tools, it's not as responsive as others. So I think it's more just, I'm trying to, I don't disagree with the way all this has been structured, but I think that our conservation program having aspirational water savings is maybe not the way. I don't think it's quite as accurate as, because we've seen real results from our conservation program. And so I think they are quantifiable with a broader range. I would just put that forward, but maybe it's something to think about as we continue to refine how we're trying to explain this in to the public, so that folks can understand the relative strengths and uncertainties around these different types of our overall conservation program approach.
Okay. So as we move into the next slide, which is just looking at again, as conservation as water supply, and understanding that, right, conservation reduces demand. That's the long-term goal of conservation, is to affect demand. And if we understate demand, we may lead to a situation where we have a shortage of water at some point in the future, or maybe there's a higher drought response action that's required because we've understated demand. Conversely, overstating demand could lead to unnecessary water supply projects and the attendant, rate increases and costs to our customers, unnecessarily so if we overstate demand. So our challenge, and I think this is kind of where you were going, Director Schmidt, is it's challenging to forecast conservation. No uncertain terms, absolutely. And so one tool perhaps we might look at, if we look at the chart to the right here, it's on the y-axis on the left, you have population, and on the right, it's gallons per capita per day. So that's this blue line, and that's the total water produced by the district divided by the total population. It's the general measure of water use efficiency for the whole district. And we might look at this line and say, yeah, it does look like the GPCD is trending down, which is a good thing. And so we could use a trend analysis here to maybe think about forecasting what that gallon per capita per day might look like in the future. But it's not as straightforward as you might think. If we take this green line that is sort of a trend going back about 20 years or so, and it looks, pretty reasonable as a fit to these sort of top high points of the GPCD, and it has a slope of about 1%. So in 25 years, you would be thinking about 25% reduction, assuming it was just linear across the board. And of course, if you took that to an absurd extent and went out 100 years, it would say we weren't using any water at all, which of course would be unreasonable. But for 25 years, you have this trend line. Yet we could choose a different period of time over which to draw our trend line. And you can see this black line on here, which has a very different slope, and yet fits the data pretty well. From these two trend analyses, you would have very, very different forecasts of future water savings and ultimately GPCD for the district. And if we overestimate or underestimate our demand, it can be quite problematic for us in the future. And just illustrating further the challenges with trend analysis, the purple line down here, this is the RGPCD. Remember, most of the water used in the district is used by residential customers. And I'm not sure what trend line we would draw through this data set. So I haven't proposed one through here at all. It looks like in some case it might be going up. Maybe it's going, generally going down, but I really don't know what the best fit line through that would look like. So how do we resolve this challenge of forecasting conservation. And as Ben said a minute ago, really the level of conservation that to be included in water supply planning in the strategic water supply assessment must be based on empirical data to ensure a high level of confidence in achieving the calculated savings. And so next up, we'll have Carrie, who will walk us through sort of the element of conservation that's included in the strategic water supply assessment.
Thank you, Paul. Carrie Pollard, Water Efficiency Manager. So using the framework that Paul outlined, staff developed a conservation program which builds off decades-long investment and commitment, not only by the district, but our customers to water efficiency. Yet it also balances the need for having a high level of confidence that these savings will actually be achieved. So to do this review, we reviewed locally specific data, such as the flume data that had been presented to the board at prior meetings, which you may recall shows that residential indoor use was already quite low. But there was opportunity looking at outdoor use. So focusing on residential outdoor and also the category here of landscapes. Yet the other sectors were also evaluated as part of this program, and they were taken into consideration for any opportunities that staff may see to reduce demands. And so the next slide is going to be kind of what would this program look like? We start off recognizing that there would be regulatory savings that would be achieved just from natural replacement of fixtures being changed out or someone changing their landscape just due to their awareness of the opportunities to reduce water use. In addition, not just natural replacement, but also from building codes and plumbing codes and any other regulatory requirements. So that means that if there's no incentive to replace a toilet and someone walks into the Home Depot, they're going to get a really efficient fixture. Likewise, a new home will also be efficient from the start, right? And those are the benefits of having those regulatory savings in place. But to build on that, we wanted to add a level of incentives as well. And so what we have here is starting from the top, these are annual projections, starting with AMI leak letters, where we proposed that we would send out over 1,000 notifications each year to our AMI customers who have leaks, who have active leaks. We project that this would increase and this increase would correspond with new AMI installations that occur within the service area. We move down to the next two bullet points of turf conversion. We have a total of 170,000 square feet per year that we would be projecting as part of this program. We have a couple of alternative water sources listed here. That would be the rain barrels and the gray water kits. With these, we want to continue to build the momentum around these programs and bring awareness. Other outdoor programs would be the pool covers and our smart irrigation controllers. And finally, closing out with the conservation assistance program. Looking forward, we would anticipate that the conservation assistance program, which is really a site visit for someone who doesn't have AMI, right? It helps us direct folks to our programs, but also helps them find leaks and opportunity to save within their home, will likely decrease as AMI rolls out, but we're projecting 500 site visits per year. All of these, I want to remember, are kind of a near-term incentive program that staff's developed based on current available technology. 5 years ago, we wouldn't have known that we would want to invest in a device like Flume. And so we would want to be able to adjust these as we move forward, but ultimately acknowledge that establishing a gallons per capita goal, our target for the district, would be, kind of help us down that path of how do we, what changes need to be made and how can we be flexible in these new programs as we roll them out. Next slide. So a question could come up is how do we come up with those, levels of participation, and are they appropriate? And so what we did here is on the left, we have each of the incentive programs or on the prior slide. In the middle, we have the level of participation that staff is projecting. And then on the right, we have the last two columns are an evaluation of the past annual participation. So pre-drought is an average of the last 5 years. And then we have our 2021 drought participation. So for the AMI leak letters, as I mentioned, we would project an increase in threshold for these notification letters as we roll out AMI. For the turf conversions at 170,000.
So then, Carrie, you actually mean a decrease, don't you?
No, we would send out more AMI leak letters to our
You send,
customers. Mhm.
you send out, why? 'Cause there's more leaks, or
Yeah,
you're
because
cutting
there would
into a
be-
lower?
Right.
Why
we'd
do you
have-
think there would be more leaks?
Well, right now with our 5,000 customers on AMI, we send out about 1,200.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're talking about after AMI is installed.
Correct. Post.
I gotcha. Okay,
Yes.
no problem. No problem. That's not so clear here.
Apologies. So looking at turf, 170,000 square feet per year, we feel that while that's, not the, 410 we saw during the drought, we do feel it's realistic. And it's based on about 3 to 4 sites per week at our average square footage of 900 square feet per site, right? When we consider the non-functional turf conversions, we would anticipate on any given site, there may be a bunch of much smaller kind of swaths of non-functional turf that would be removed, which might raise our average, but nevertheless, that was how we determined the 170. And the remaining program levels, while they're not, again, at the levels we saw during the drought, we feel that they're beyond you'll notice they're well beyond the pre-drought participation levels. So, a discussion could be had or a suggestion could be made that we should just increase these participation levels. But we want to make it clear, it's really important, kind of goes back to what Ben was stating, that staff arrived at these levels because we think they're achievable, right? And the resulting water savings, which we'll discuss on the next slide, we feel that we can responsibly include them in the strategic water supply assessment as a reduction in required demands. So we look at the next slide, we'll talk about the water savings. So what we have here is projected demands and the associated water savings from the program I just described. On the left, we have each sector and then the projected savings. This has been adjusted, it was initially pulled from the urban water management plan, but it has been adjusted due to the RANA population increase that's been, that is foreseeing into the future here at the district. The baseline we're using is 2020, and that results in 124 gallons per person per day. If you click forward, Paul, if we focus our attention over in 2045, which is the end of the timing horizon, the planning horizon for this activity, results in 4,000, just over 4,000 acre feet reduction in demands in 2045, and that would result in an associated gallons per person per day for the district. So there's district-wide of 106. Go on to the next slide. There could be a question of, is 2020 the best year to compare this to, right? And so I think we can go back to the image that Paul already described for us, and we can see, really anywhere you start within the past 20 plus years, 106, which you can click forward one more, you can drop the line in there. 106 continues to decline and decrease and increase efficiency, reduce demands district-wide despite the growth in population. So we feel that that's effective and really the direction that aligns with our ongoing goals. The next slide. So we can look at where do these water savings really come from? Which sector do they hit? I want to note that these estimates were calculated using the Alliance for Water Efficiency's tracking tool, and they break out sector-specific reductions. So in 2045, the majority of the reductions would come from our single-family and multifamily sectors, which is not surprising considering the water use breakdown within those areas as well. Next slide. So we looked at the past trends for GPCD. We could take a moment and look forward out into 2045 using that 2020 as a comparison of district-wide per capita use starting at 124 and the residential GPCD, right? So that's just our residential customers' water use at 87 gallons per person per day. And when we look forward, it would bring it down to, in 2045, to 106 GPCD district-wide, and for residential sector only, it would be 73 gallons per person per day. We did build into all of these projections compliance with the state mandates around water use objectives as well. Just wanted to note that. Next slide. So in summary, the conservation as supply that has been built into the strategic water supply assessment results in an adjusted 2045 demand in water to be 27,427 acre feet. mentioned numerous times, the GPCD for the district would be 106. The residential specific GPCD would be 73. As part of this process, we did evaluate the cost to fund this program. For the district costs, so district only costs would be about just under $3,000 per acre foot. The annual budget estimate for these incentives is 2.1 million. So this is only for the incentive programs and the associated program management for those incentives. So outreach associated with driving customers to those incentives, staff time, etc. It does not include the other component of the program, which would be the school education and other non-incentive based expenditures. We also acknowledge, and I think this may be kind of what possibly what Director Schmidt was getting at, is that customer contribution, right? So, you know, the level of participants really depends on our customers participating in our programs and them making the commitment to take action as well. And so we attempted to calculate what the customer cost would be per acre foot. And so this would be include the hardware, any hardware, if they're changing their landscape, it'd be plant material, labor, et cetera, installation and maintenance costs for each of the incentivized programs. And then I believe that was my last slide. Moving on. So up next, we have Peter Mayer, and Paul did introduce Peter as one of the urban water experts. He's done much of his work is focused on urban water management and water use research, designing and evaluating water efficiency measures, and also forecasting future demands both with and without conservation. And with that background, it seems fitting that he would be able to give us kind of a critical review, a peer review, if you would, of what we're proposing and any additional thoughts he may have. So with that, I'll turn it over to Peter.
Thank you very much, Carrie. Can you hear me okay? Great. Well, it's a pleasure to be able to speak to you again. Let's go to the next slide. So I was asked to take a look at the proposed conservation program that Carrie just presented and to take a look at whether it's reasonable and achievable, essentially. And then also to look at, well, is a more aggressive conservation program possible? And if yes, what might it take? And so I tried to do both of those things. So starting first with what we just looked at, the conservation program that has been integrated into the strategic water supply assessment. Significantly, for when I look at this program, I think it's significant because it addresses the most likely areas where you're going to achieve future savings. It doesn't really monkey around, and it focuses right in on leaks and then on outdoor use. Other areas are being addressed either through codes and standards or have already been reduced or are very difficult to address. So it's significant that this program actually invests directly in areas where I think you're most likely to achieve the future savings. The program budget is absolutely quite substantial for a utility of this size. $2.1 million, and that doesn't even include all of the educational components, which means that, if you fund this, at that approximate level, over the next 20 years or so, you're looking at a $40 to $50 million or more investment in water conservation in your community, which is absolutely substantial. And on a per capita basis, as Carrie pointed out, you're higher than anyone else in the region. And when we did this analysis and compared the per capita nationally, I couldn't find another utility, actually, except during an extreme drought situation that was spending at that comparable level. So the other thing that I think is important to realize is that what Carrie outlined tonight, is the program that you're looking at moving forward for the next year, and foreseeable immediate future. This is a program that can and will be adapted over time, and that's the you need to do it with conservation because the situation changes and your investment may need to change. But significantly, it establishes a goal of 106 gallons per capita per day total and 73 residential, which is really meaningful. I mean, it's a substantial reduction from where you were just in 2020, and the overall volumetric savings end up being significant. I also think it's an achievable goal, given the level of investment and what we've seen capable of during drought, I think that this is a level that the community will be able to achieve given this level of investment. So let's go to the next slide. So quick comparison. It's a little hard to do a true apples to apples comparison of, where you stand in California. These data actually come from pre-COVID, pre-drought. It's the average of, it's hard to read at the bottom, but it's 17, 18, and 19. And I put up the number, the baseline of 124, where we're starting from, and the 106, which is sort of the future level that we're forecasting. And if you have a chance to look a little closer, maybe eventually, the utilities who are using way less than 100 gallons per capita per day are very, very small, and generally not a good analogy for a utility the size of Marin. At 106, it puts you right there with among the most efficient at that time period for utilities of your size in California. So let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so let's think about, what else could you do? Is something more aggressive possible? And given the level of investment and the focus on the addressable areas, I think in order to actually achieve more savings beyond what's been proposed here, you really would have to take a different tactic. And the tactic would have to be much more focused on enforcement, creating water budgets for all the customers, establishing a reasonable level of use, tracking people's use to those budgets, and then, enforcing to that level. I'm not sure all of these measures would be necessary together, but certainly a number of these things in concert I think would be required to go beyond what you've got, what you're proposing. One of the things that could be considered would be even stricter water efficient landscape ordinances than you already have in place that could limit turf installations in future new developments. You could only allow low water use plants or drip irrigation in new developments and remodels significantly. I mean, I think it's important if you're going to go to this level that it not just be borne by new customers, but also be incorporated into existing customers as well. You could prohibit additionally non-functional turf. And remember, the current program is proposing incentivizing 170,000 square feet per year, and presumably there'd even be more that might happen without incentive. This would be a requirement and making it more mandatory. And then ultimately, what they're doing in Las Vegas is prohibiting front yard turf and restricting allowable turf. And I think if that may be something that would need to be considered depending on whether you're achieving the level of demand reductions. So you need to consider, the future landscape, and that's an important consideration, I think, when doing this water supply planning. So you could also require stricter indoor fixtures and standards, which is very difficult to do at the local level, but something that could be considered. And then finally, the ultimate for indoor is really retrofit on resale. So whenever there's a change of use, a change at an address of service, that is an opportunity. Then you can ensure that they have installed all of the most efficient fixtures and also complied with all of the landscape regulations. I can tell you, it is not a particularly popular policy when it has been implemented, but it is absolutely a way to ensure that all properties and all buildings, in a community, achieve a maximum level of efficiency. Okay, next slide. So with that, I think you could get probably below what has been forecast at 106. Now, we haven't done nearly the same level of analysis on a regulatory forecast. So I've sort of done more of a back of the envelope estimate, assuming that that would get you close to 100 gallons per capita per day. Possibly you could go below that with, given it depends on what level of enforcement or policies you wanted to pursue. But that's more, I think what it would take to get you down below what your current proposal is, which is really maximizing the incentivized and more voluntary approach. Next slide. So in terms of what that policy-driven program might look like, I think it would drive the RGPC down below 73, closer to 69. I think the district cost would go up. Carrie and I did some quick estimates. We think it would add some additional FTE for managing the regulatory aspects. And that's really what largely drives the additional district costs. But it would also drive some additional customer costs related to compliance with the enforcement, with the regulations. But again, this has not been analyzed at the same level as the program that as Carrie presented as being integrated into the water supply. This is really more to give you just a sort of a sense of what you might be looking at. And then finally, let's go to the next slide. So just to summarize the questions, is the proposed conservation program reasonable and achievable? Yes, I would say absolutely. The program offers a reasonable budget, actually a substantial budget, I would say. It provides a savings target that is meaningful and will achieve substantial savings, and a suite of measures that are designed to take you in that direction. But I also think you can expect adaptation and changes over the next 20 years. That's just normal to think about that. Is a more aggressive program possible? Yes, it is, but it would require a stricter regulatory approach, probably including water budgets, enforcement related to that, and very strict landscape codes. And I think if you want to go that approach, you need to consider and do much more analysis than I've been able to do on the impact of these deeper demand reductions, particularly the landscapes, and also to what it might mean for the non-residential sector, because you would not want to unintentionally impact the economic future of the community, simply trying to force demand down, without understanding what that looked like. I really think what's been proposed is a very strong program and a significant, and it really is taking the aspect of the there's regulatory components, but it's really incentivized conservation. As far as I think you're going to get to about as low as you're going to be able to get with that style of a program. So hopefully that addresses what was asked of me, but I'll be happy to answer questions later on when they come up. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Peter. So just our last slide, we'll wrap up quickly here. So just a summary, we looked at the district's existing conservation program, and in terms of its elements, right, regulatory and policies, the incentives and the education and outreach components, and it really is industry leading, and it's well funded. We looked at how conservation factors into the strategic water supply assessment. Carrie outlined for us the number of initiatives that would be involved there, and that quantified the water savings in 2045, about 4,009 acre feet, at a per acre foot cost of 2,951 per acre foot. We also saw that, I don't know if we saw that tonight, but conservation at this point is built into the strategic water supply assessment. It's a component that's in there from the get-go. There's just didn't appear to staff anyway that there was ever a potential for us to be moving forward without an element of conservation included in the strategic water supply assessment. And so what we've included in there is this quantifiable with a relative high level of confidence that we can achieve those calculated savings. We do plan to continue to develop the district's sort of overall master plan for conservation, leveraging innovation and technology, and for example, exploring the removal of barriers to greater participation in on-site reuse areas such as gray water and rainwater harvesting. And if you just think for a moment how that might relate to what both Carrie and Peter have stressed, and that is the program that we've talked about tonight, is just those initiatives are what we're starting with, right? And those initiatives we would expect to change over time. So as we get more information on gray water, as we learn more about gray water and rainwater harvesting, those can be brought back into the strategic water supply assessment at future dates. But so that concludes our presentation for the evening.
Thank you, Paul, and to the other speakers. Public comment?
Yes, we have four. Mr. Chris Wright, then Larry Minikes. Go ahead, Mr. Wright.
Yeah, mine goes back to the towers. My hand was raised on communication towers, and you moved on without you lowered my hand. So maybe you guys should go to a regular meeting, because I know you'd hear me at a regular meeting. But what my question was, I asked the first question about the cell towers, and it seems like nobody's a specialist on the cell towers. Did you guys hire an outside source to ask them about, to confront, before you make an agreement that, could we gain from this by having something done in this?
Yes.
Yes, you did hire a specialist?
Yes, we did.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wright. Did you have a comment for this item?
No.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Wright. Mr. Larry Minikes, please.
Good evening. That was a very informative presentation this evening. Very much appreciated. And if I'm doing my numbers right, it appears that by 2045, we're looking at a modest 14 to 16% reduction in water use, which seems doable, even given the fact that Marin is doing pretty good on conservation already. So incrementally, it seems very doable without causing people pain or feeling like they're rationing or something else. It can be part of our lifestyle. But I'd like to switch the subject over to the supply side and to watershed management, and to using forest thinning for water yield. And this has been a science, an ongoing science for decades. And here we're not discussing this. And the question is, should we be looking at that calculation when we're doing forest thinning? How does that improve our water yield? Knowing that it's very complicated because it depends on the method, it depends on how much is being done and where it's being done. So there's no clear, if you do an acre here, you gain this much. Doesn't work that way. However, when we're looking at investing, this is where we get a twofer, where we're working on reducing fuel load, but we can also do a calculation on, is this increasing water yield? And if we can get 1%, 2% this way, it's something that becomes actually quite meaningful over time. And so I wanted to add that to the conversation and hope that we'll add this element some way to this, because everything should be considered at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Minikes. The next three speakers, Kimmery, Wiltshire, Phil Sauter, then Roger Roberts. Go ahead, Ms. Wiltshire. Go ahead, Ms. Wiltshire. Okay, I'll come back to you. Mr. Phil Sauter, please.
Yeah, thank you for that presentation. It was very interesting. In getting ready for tonight's meeting, I hadn't seen that presentation, and I kind of came at the numbers from a different way, and I'm really kind of surprised where the places where we are in absolute agreement and a few places where we're not. The first thing I noticed that in 45 years, in spite of a population increase, the district has dropped its daily usage by 5 million gallons a day, or about 5,000 acre feet. And this, I believe, has been done by a mix of sudden emergency rationing during a drought and steady low budget conservation measures. I tried to take a look at what would it be worth to us to use a steady, more impactful, more expensive, managed conservation program to drop our daily usage by another 2.5 million gallons a day, or 2,500 acre feet on a long-term predictable basis. And I'm going to underline predictable. First, I ask if that shot is even on the board. Well, I think we know that single-family water use is 12,000, a single-family residential water use is 12,000 acre feet, and half of that is outdoor water usage, or 6,000 acre feet. So yes, there have been times in drought emergencies when we went after all 6,000 acre feet. So a goal of 2,500 acre feet seems very doable. A second question I ask is, how much would we be willing to spend to conserve that 2,500 acre feet? I looked at the other options we're looking at for water supply, and a lot of them are in the 3,000 to 5,000 range. So I used $4,000 as a number that we might be willing to spend. $4,000 an acre foot times 2,500 acre feet through conservation gave me a budget of $10 million annually. That's at least triple what we're currently spending, and perhaps 10 times the funds that are actually getting through to customers, as opposed to what's spent on salaries and other non-direct expenditures. It's also worth noting that unlike other options, many conservation programs like re-landscaping might be once and done. It's also worth noting that a long-term managed conservation program is not aspirational, and it absolutely requires hard data on what customers are actually doing and requires daily data like a flume device or an AMI device. So that's kind of where I come out. I think we're really looking at numbers like a budget that we haven't seen before, and I'm putting $10 million out there just to stretch our muscles. I've got 11 seconds. I'll try to urge you to look at what Santa Clara Water District is doing. They were on the news last night, $3,000 rebate, $5 million budget for the program, part of which came from a parcel tax. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Roger Roberts, please.
Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Good. I have a couple of questions that maybe you can answer. It looks like you're going to be investing budget-wise about 2.1 million a year. And is it possible that you can finance that as a capital investment? Will the laws permit you, or the regulatory authorities permit you to do that? Because if you can finance that as part of your debt financing going forward, it should be included when you're making your plans going forward. And then I have another question. At 73 gallons per customer per day, what water rates required in order to cover all your costs of operating and capital investment? So those are my two major questions, and I hope you can answer positively to both. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just a comment, Roger, that JPCD is per capita. So we only have 60,000 customers for 191,000 people. So be careful with the word customer there, because I would think the customers are the ones that have the meters, which are the 60,000, not the individuals. So when we're talking about that, we're actually talking about the population.
Yeah, well, I'm talking about the population. We're talking about water sales. Total.
Yes, but you use the word customer, and there's only 60,000. The GPCD is per person. So some houses have 3. Okay.
But
let me see.
But at that GPCD is at 73 gallons. Is that going to cover your operating costs and capital investment costs in the future? Or will you be operating below break even?
Good question.
And then the other question is, it's my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, that conservation programs are not eligible for capital funding. If that is true, then you need to focus on AMI, which can be included, and all the other program costs you have to absorb in the future as operating costs. Is that true or not true?
And Brett, can you speak to that?
It's my understanding that we cannot capitalize the costs associated with staff. And so I believe Mr. Roberts is correct that that would have to be borne by the operating budget.
Well, that's an interesting problem in terms of, how you're going to finance this program. You'll have to finance it through water rates.
Thank you, Mr. Roberts. Let's see if we can go back to Kimberly Wiltshire. Kimberly? All right. Next three speakers, Clayton Smith, Ed Jamison, and 1402. Go ahead, Clayton Smith.
I think with regard to this conservation program, I think there's a limit to it. I think there's a kind of law of diminishing returns. At a certain point, you've squeezed everything people are willing to give voluntarily or even under mild coercion out of the whole game, and it just runs out of steam. And it's interesting that the number that you're coming up with the realistic amount of reduction, I keep going back to the housing element being foisted on us by the state's, I think, misguided legislature for a mandated 8% increase in housing in Marin County over this next 8-year period of time, which pretty much erases all of the proposed savings coming out of this project. So it's kind of like being on a treadmill, and it certainly doesn't solve the epiphenomenal problem that you face. And of course, that brings up into my mind, we hear these very authoritarian and coercive things such as retrofit on resale, which is a very unhappy thought. And all this stuff, it works to reduce the attractiveness of living in Marin, which would be reflected in property prices and their impact on future tax revenues, et cetera. And I think this is all because in the past, we didn't adequately deal with this issue appropriately, such as a pipeline from the north and raising the dams and digging new dams. And so this conversation seems to me to be dodging the issue. It's taking time and putting aside on something that really is dodging the issue, which is what I just said, which is the pipeline from the north, raising the dams, and focusing our attention on that and digging some new reservoirs so that we can build up some adequate reserves. And also, I think we have to deal with the fact that if honestly we were to look at the demographics of this country, if it weren't for that open border down there, we would not be having to deal with an anticipated large increase in demand. I was just looking at population statistics for Marin, and Marin's population has been pretty much flat for, I guess, the last decade at least, if not longer. So I think we should get back to the business of actually getting those dams, pipelines, all that stuff built instead of worrying about conservation increases. Thank you.
Smith. Mr. Ed Jamison, please.
Hang on a second. Ben, do you want to respond to that?
Well, what we're doing tonight is to respond to community questions that have come up in terms of trying to provide absolute clarity in terms of the amount of conservation that's being proposed to incorporate into the water supply. And this is a very important discussion because we do need to get future demands right. We need to ideally have the community understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. And really, because as Paul characterized it, if you shoot too high in your conservation projection, could leave the district water short in a drought. if you shoot too low, potentially we expend dollars and burden the ratepayers in a way we may not need to. So I think this is an important discussion. I don't anticipate we're going to continue to talk about conservation. We are going to focus on the water supply options. I think everyone knows from what I hear that we need to look into that. So this is a step in the overall process, and I keep talking about this as we move forward.
Thank you.
Mr. Ed Jamison?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Loud and clear.
I just wanted to say this is yet another really outstanding presentation by district staff. And again, Mr. Mayor, you're really wonderful at this. You have tremendous credibility, and it's reassuring to have you come on and back up the district staff as well. Again, a job well done again tonight. I just had one comment on the cost. $3,000 an acre foot is not cheap. And apparently there's another $3,000 from the customer. That's $6,000 an acre foot. Or if you want to be more aggressive, it's $4,000 plus $4,000 and $8,000 an acre foot. This is not cheap water. It may be justified in terms of reducing demand, but these cost numbers actually surprise me. So thank you again for all the good work tonight.
Thank you.
I'd like to chime in maybe about the numbers here for a second, because we didn't have board comment at the end of the presentation. So it's been great to hear comments from the folks who have tuned in. But I think a couple of quick points here, which is one is that very obviously conservation is not the solution to our future water needs. It is something, as has been repeatedly said, it's a part of the mix, and we're just trying to figure out what is the right part of the mix. So stating the obvious again, but just so that it's clear for folks who might be interpreting the attention that we're providing on this as overly focusing on this. It's just one part of our mix. And it is very complicated to figure stuff out. Conservation, we are midstream on conservation, as maybe the way I would put it. We've been doing it for a while. It's been part of the water management solutions that have been implemented not only here in Marin, but throughout the West and throughout the world as we deal with water shortages, as a chronic problem as population grows and demand increases and so forth. So figuring out how to see what we have done in the context of other communities, as Peter, you've presented in your data, has really been quite helpful. But there's cities to the right and there's cities to the left, and where is Marin in that mix? So I think it's complicated, and I think you made that point. One of the things that is extremely important to us is the cost, because we want to be cost effective. We want to make sure that we are able to keep costs as low as possible while providing secure and reliable water supplies. And to that end, I'm a little, I'm not an expert in conservation, so I don't mean to in any way to cast myself as that. But having read reports in the past that have looked at the costs of conservation, I know that it is very complex. And I just would simply point to one of the seminal reports that I had looked at years ago and reviewed again today is a Pacific Institute report that was done in 2016 that looked at the cost per acre foot for different conservation measures. And it takes a different, I think, approach than maybe what we've applied, because the numbers are pretty starkly different in terms of cost per yield. And so I think that one of the things that I think would be helpful, and I don't know, Peter, I don't want to put you on the spot to respond to a report that's out there. I think that would be unfair, but I do think that it would be interesting to take a look at that report and maybe others that have attempted to, at a broad scale, look at the cost of conservation yield and see how we're measuring up, and to see that because I know this is a complicated topic that we just want to get right. And I think that would be something that would be really helpful, so that we can understand, the cost of this tool relative to the other water supply alternatives that we're considering.
Well, staff will take a look at that, potentially working with Peter. I was able, there was some discussion about this report. I was able to glance at it. I think that one reason those numbers are low may be that they just included the incentives. You know, how much are you giving someone as an incentive for a shower head? What we did is include that, of course, but also the programmatic costs to implement the programs, the staff time. We didn't even include all the outreach we do to advertise those programs, but that's another cost. So we used our actual budgeting cost. It's pretty straightforward what we did, but I do think with the questions that are raised, let staff take a look at that. Let us break down the analysis for how we came up with these costs and share that with the board. I do think that would be useful.
That'd be great. Thanks, Ben. I appreciate that you looked into that in advance. I think that might have been something that you'd heard from other quarters, but you know, and I think it would also just be also interesting to look at neighboring cities that, you know, that also again might give us a sense of what their projections are, what they think, you know, in terms of, like, I look at East Bay Mud, what are they predicting that they can achieve with ongoing conservation and efficiency, just to see whether their projections of per capita water use is likely to follow a similar trend. Just to, again, it's helpful to see us in the context of our neighbors that experience a similar climate, similar, you know, populations in a way. That gives us a sense of having a good picture.
We'll include that as well in our.
Great.
Remember, Monty, our friends like East Bay Mud also have a watershed near Yosemite, you know, so it's coming from a long ways away. You know, they have a different water supply situation, which changes their incentive on conservation.
Totally, I don't disagree, but I'm looking at merely per capita water use. I know they have a very different water supply management portfolio than ours, and so that I would not seek to compare. But in terms of what they expect of what could be achieved with ongoing conservation and what that might cost, I think that you know, if it's not comparable, then let's see how it's not. But I think it would be worthwhile to take a look at.
And Carrie, do you know that answer?
I will say that we will look relatively aggressive compared to East Bay Mud in terms of their projections and ours. But let us take a hard look. We can look at East Bay Mud, Contra Costa, what they're, where they are now and what they're projecting and how they will go about it.
Yeah, and I just
which is why I brought up they're different in water supply, because they're not as driven. They have a much broader watershed than we do physically. So they're in a kind of a better situation than we are proportional to their population. They aren't as incented on the conservation side.
Do I continue with the public comments?
Sure.
Okay, I have 1402, then James Krajewski, please. 1402.
James Holmes, Larkspur. The projections for additional water savings do seem somewhat at variance with a comment made by your consultant Jacobs in his initial meeting, the May 10th meeting, in which he said, quote, regarding the prospect for additional conservation, quote, "The sponge has already been squeezed," unquote. And so that seems to be a little bit different from what we are hearing tonight. If I understand correctly, the proposed conservation built into the water supply analysis, it is essentially a continuation of the existing measures. Certainly, any additional measures would seem to be quite draconian and expensive based on the information provided here. And I think it is fair to say that at some point, people will grow tired of being squeezed like sponges, to use the consultant's analogy. Thank you.
Thank you. That was
this is
Mr. Meyer that made that statement, not Jacobs.
Right. And Peter's here, and
That
my
was me. That was me. Yes, I'm sorry if
Peter, can you clarify my recollection, and maybe I'm wrong, is that you said that in regards to indoor use, and you've always indicated that there are opportunities in outdoor use. Is that a right characterization? Or
Yeah, that's definitely part of it. And also the comment was in regard to the level of water use that Marin had achieved during the drought response too, which already dropped your demand considerably. And I think it's also reflective in why we're not showing demand going down even further than has been forecast. So I didn't mean to imply when I said that the sponge had been squeezed that there wasn't any potential for additional conservation, because that's not the case. There certainly is. But I think it is certainly true. It is going to get more and more difficult to get that, and also more and more expensive to get it through whatever mechanism it would take to get.
Thank you. Mr. James Krajewski.
Hi, just want to thank everyone for excellent presentation and discussion. One thing that would be helpful to probably some people, at least to me, is sometimes to put a tagline on about some of the definitions. For example, when we're talking about residential water use, what is a residence, or what exactly are we talking about in terms of residential use as opposed to other uses? And sometimes in presentations, it would be useful, for example, just to have a quick chart or review of what is that as a percentage of the total water use in Marin, residential versus business versus what other categories you might have. So that's just my thought about tonight's presentation. But thanks very much for all the hard work and great presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Krajewski. The next two speakers, Christy Cohen and Elaine Dulcini. Go ahead, Ms. Cohen.
Hi, I apologize. I got to the meeting a little bit late tonight, so I may have missed this. But I wondered, how much water supply do we actually need to be resilient, and or how many years of supply are we aiming for? Over and out.
Thanks for the question. I think tonight we were focused largely on conservation, and explaining what elements and how much conservation was included in the strategic water supply assessment. And the purpose of the overall assessment is indeed to answer, I think, the question that you just asked, which is how much water supply do we need to be resilient? So we're working on that.
And Miss Elaine Dulcini, please.
Good evening. I also came on late, but I heard the latter parts of the presentation, and I really do think that Marin County it needs to seek permanent solutions, and I agree that conservation is a very important part of the permanent solution to water conservation, or to solving the problem of limited water supply, that as the climate changes, so people are more willing to change. It's not an empty sponge that can't be squeezed anymore. It's an adapting, changing, complex situation where, as the water and climate changes, people are more willing to do different things in order to, achieve the goals that they want for their landscapes or whatever it is, and to find alternate ways to washing their cars and other things. So I really appreciate your work with conservation, and was very encouraged to see where Marin County stands with compared to other counties. And I do disagree with one of the comments that came in saying, you know, what we need to do is go and, you know, develop those dams. And, you know, the more you take away from the environment and the land, the less you have from the land in terms of agriculture and environment. And it's all connected. I'm trying to put my words together. I always arrive at these meetings a little bit less articulate than I want to be, but what I do know is that to have what we want is a permanent, reliable water supply. And I don't think that dams are going to be, that's an old alternative. Maybe it worked in the past, but it's an old idea that just doesn't work anymore. There's too many environmental costs, too many costs, period, for no guarantee with the low rainfall. Thank you.
Thank you. And there are no further speakers.
Okay, any other board comments?
I do want to also congratulate Peter for what I think is a very balanced, thoughtful presentation. Yeah, nice job.
Agree. Okay, with that, we're going to move on to the future meetings.
Thank you. Good evening, President Russell and directors. Our next meetings for the board are internal meetings, the regular bi-monthly meetings, August 16th. The next day is the communications and water efficiency meeting. Then that Friday, same week, is the operations committee meeting. And then the following week, we'll have our finance and administration committee meeting on the 25th. For external meetings, I did find out that the Tamales Bay Watershed Foundation will have their meeting on August 11th at 3 p.m. And then after that, there's a few weeks where the next external meeting would be September 2nd, which is the North Bay Watershed Association Board meeting, and that's at 9:30. That's all I have for this report.
Thank you. Okay, with that, we will adjourn.
Okay, thank you all.
Later.